Camera number 188 of 365 is the Canon EOS 650. Requires a battery to operate all its functions, so I'll undo the grip, which is where the battery is housed. Right, so we have the battery grip off, which now allows us to see our battery chamber, which is actually on the base, and it houses a 2CR5 battery, which is placed in that way, thus, and then we can put the battery or the grip back on. There we go. I must say this grip is incredibly comfortable, which is saying something for someone who prefers Nikon cameras. The grip just seems to be just made for me. It really does. It feels incredibly comfortable, very reassuring. Can hold it incredibly comfortably, and that's a good thing, because then that means you're at one and hopefully produce some good images. So with the battery in, we can now turn the camera on, but while we're in the front, we'll just go through some of the features in the front. We have our lens release with press the button. The pictures were taken with this zoom lens, which is an EF 35 to 135, 4 to f4 to 5.6. Found that quite a nice reach. And then the only other buttons we have are this electronic depth preview button, and then an M button, which is used when the camera is set in manual mode to change the aperture, because there is only one command dial which defaults when in manual mode to changing the shutter speed, so we have to use that, but we'll mention that in a bit. Okay, so let's put the lens back on. There we go. On the base there is only a tripod mount, because obviously the battery chamber. The film chamber has a lever and a lock button, so that then allows us to open our chamber. Notice the DX coding. This can be overridden, and let's just go into that. There's a little flap here that uncovers some other functions of the camera, with which are similar to the other sort of series, the 700, the 600. So we have that mid-roll rewind turning on my left, and then the orange button is autofocus mode. So let's just turn, camera's on, so we can go from one shot to servo. And then the next button allows us to cycle through single release, continuous release. You can see that, sorry, I haven't got that in very good position. I can't hold it there, that's the problem. And then if we hold it down again, we can turn the self-timer on. Let's just put that back to single. And then we have a battery check function. And then if we press both the orange and the blue buttons together, we can override the DX coding and choose our own shutter speed. There we go. Right. Okay. On the right hand side here we have the command dial. It's changing currently my ISO, and then our release, because it hasn't been able to achieve focus, won't be able to release, so let's just change that to M, and then we can release the button. Okay. On the other side we have the dial that changes our settings to program mode. That's like a point and shoot. Camera makes all the decisions. We can't override it. If we want to override program mode, we can go past lock, which is also the on-off button, to A, and then with program mode in this allows us to, it is shiftable, we can change our combination of aperture and shutter, which the camera deems is correct. When we're on A, we can then go through a series of modes, shutter priority, and so the command dial changes the shutter speed. In aperture mode, we can change our aperture, and then if we go to depth, that's everything in focus mode, if you like. I think it's a bit more complicated than that, but that's how I look at it. And then finally, we can go into manual mode, which, as I mentioned, the command dial changes the shutter speed, but if we press the M button, we can now change our aperture, and looking through the viewfinder, we get our shutter and aperture reading, but there is no scale to show whether, when we're in manual mode, whether we're good in terms of our metering. So the way they do this in this particular mode is it recommends, if we hold manual down, whether you can see that, it says OP, and what that means is we need to open our aperture. So if we open the aperture, which we can't really do here on this mode, so let's just change the shutter speed down a bit so we can demonstrate this. 45 should, let's go for a 60th. So holding down the manual mode, there we go. The two O's mean we've achieved correct exposure. If we move the aperture, so it's telling us to open the aperture, so we need to go down. If we open it too far, it's telling us to close the aperture. So we move it again, and then we've achieved correct exposure. So open aperture, close aperture. Very simple, but a very effective method. And you get that through the viewfinder. So you can look through the viewfinder and just change by holding down the manual, which allows us to change our aperture. So we can fully immerse ourselves in our photography without having to look at the top plate. Now the final setting on this dial is audible beeps, which won't function here on this particular occasion in manual mode. We do have a separate button for exposure compensation, so we do -5 or +5. And then the final button on the back here is a memory lock button, so we can dial in our, look at that through our viewfinder, get our correct exposure. If the subject is slightly off center, we can lock that exposure by holding the button down and then recompose and take the photograph. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. There are a number of functions there in the camera, but that has been camera number 188 of 365.